Original research. Eric hated the rain. And rain was what it did in July in Auckland. And in May and June and August and September too. Sometimes Eric found himself wondering why he was in this damp, isolated little nation in the South Pacific. Of course the reason was clear: graduate school cost half as much here as it did in the US. But knowing the answer didn't stop him from asking himself that question every time it rained like this. It was nearly 10 p.m. and he was finally done at the lab. These 12-hour days were killers, but Eric had only one more semester left to finish his work. He had resolved himself to spending the winter months locked away in his lab until he made some kind of breakthrough. If only he knew what he was waiting for. Eric stepped out of the rain-soaked street and into a corner dairy. It was a long walk back to his flat and he needed something warm in his stomach, not to mention in his chilled hands, for the journey. The dairy was bright and typically cramped, the faint aroma of peppermint tea filled the air. The Indian man behind the counter was watching some strange Indian movie on his telly, the kind where the actors danced and sang for no apparent reason. The clerk briefly glanced up at him in greeting. Eric nodded in return. After filling a paper cup with hot water, he picked out a newspaper. There was only one copy left, and went to the counter. Eric always enjoyed the odd looks he got when he bought a newspaper at 10 at night. But the Indian clerk said nothing and showed no interest in his odd selection. "For 10, stated the clerk in what was clearly a South African accent. "Cheers, mate," Eric replied in his flat American accent, handing the man his money and heading back into the darkened street. Whatever the weather, Eric always tried to enjoy his walk home. It was his time of solitude and reflection. He didn't have to think about his experiments or deal with his flatmates, it was just him and his thoughts. Raindrops pattered in puddles and on cement as he walked, enveloping him in a cocoon of white noise, perfect for such a contemplative stroll. Of course he found himself at home all too soon. Eric took the last sip of his rapidly cooling chamomile tea and headed inside. "Well, hello there. Jesus, mate, do you ever take a break?" Eric smiled back at Dan, who was looking at the clock as though he were a parent shocked their child had broken curfew. "Well, work is work, you know. You don't stop doing it because you want to, you stop when you've done all you can and all you need to." Dan shook his head. "There's working hard and there's being obsessive, and you, my friend, are treading the line." "Well, I'm home now, and I'm too starved to have this discussion with you again, so let's talk later." Dan looked at Eric sternly for a moment, then broke into a smile and wrapped his big arm around Eric's neck. "Just messing with you, bro. I know you have to work, just try to have some fun too." Eric broke free, now smiling too. Yeah. Hey, you try doing my job. Remember, I have to create original research to earn that doctorate." "Original research, huh? You know what passes for original these days?" "Well, my research really is going to be original and it really will benefit a lot of people. If I ever finish it, that is." Dan shook his head again, laughing. "Good luck with that, see you tomorrow." "Well, if I'm up early enough," he mocked, heading down the hall. Eric made himself a cheap student's dinner of noodles and leftover chicken. It was another meal spent alone. Thinking back, he couldn't even remember the last time he ate a meal with another person. It had to have been a month at least. No girlfriend, no close mates, no family for 12,000 miles. Being a grad student in a foreign country was a tough life. But it would all be worth it if his research went somewhere. Eric thought that one day he might work at the prestigious National Institutes of Health in Washington, D.C., the brain center of medical research. On occasion, he even found himself daydreaming about receiving a Nobel Prize. Greatness required sacrifice, and he was fully prepared to put in his time. Eric had learned to live on 6 hours sleep, so he rolled out of bed at just after 6 a.m. It was still pitch dark outside, but there were birds chirping. After a breakfast that consisted mostly of tea and English muffins, Eric was ready for another day of research. The morning sky was dominated by the dark grey clouds that seemed ever present in July, but it wasn't raining, yet. The 20-year-old diesel buses that Auckland still used would puff past him every couple minutes as he walked, spewing a cloud of black soot into his face. "Clean and green," he muttered sarcastically, recalling New Zealand's tourism domain. Finally he arrived on campus and headed into his lab building. As Eric switched on the flickering fluorescent lights, little white mice in cages on the wall squeaked and skittered about in a flurry of activity. "Hello little ones, how was your night?" "Better than mine, I'm sure." Eric chuckled to himself. "Oh well, it is good to see you all again too after so many, hours apart." Eric smiled as he prepared his work. He was studying the effects of degenerative diseases of the brain like Huntington's, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's. Unlike most research being done on how to prevent the diseases, Eric was actually focused on how to cause them. Eric believed that if he was able to figure out how to cause them, he could then learn how to prevent them. It was tolling work. He had to watch as his many serums failed and the mice he injected died twitching deaths or became blind and erratic. Finally, though, he was making progress, major progress. Eric had discovered that while he could not yet see a way to cure the diseases, he did develop a way to trigger what seemed to be an entirely different kind of degeneration in one mouse. In fact, degeneration wasn't even the right word for it. The mouse's brain wasn't damaged as in Alzheimer's, and it suffered no physical or sensory symptoms like the other diseases caused. It rather seemed that its brain had been cleaned, erased, but not permanently destroyed. The mouse was able to relearn tasks at the same rate as a baby mouse. It just started over, like rebooting a computer after the hard drive crashed. All the memory was lost, but it still functioned. It was an exciting development, but the problem was he was unable to replicate it in the other mice. For a week he had failed, but yesterday he had discovered the solution. The serum had to be tailored to the specific mouse it was to be used on. The implications were amazing. He might be able to cure other degenerative diseases by rebooting part of the brain, clearing out the damaged portion. At the moment the serum was useless as it would totally wipe a patient's brain back to infancy. But if H could create a more selective form of the serum to use for a partial reboot, he would have a real breakthrough. He dared not inform anyone of the kind of research he was doing, but he had suspicions that other students were aware. He was quite concerned about somebody stealing his work. It wasn't patented and intellectual theft was all too common. The other problem, of course, was that all his work was on mice, and when it came to testing experimental drugs on human brains, the restrictions were severe. Even if he did have a breakthrough, it might not go anywhere if human testing was never allowed. About noon there was a knock on his door. "Hello, hello." The door swung open and Dr. Tyler, his advisor, strode in looking cheery and well-rested as always. Eric was never sure how she stayed so fresh-looking when she worked such long hours. She was, like Eric, married to the job. The only difference was that Dr. Tyler was being paid quite well for her research. Eric worked for free. "Ah, there you are, Eric. How is the work coming along?" she asked brightly. "Well, I am making a good deal of progress now, Doctor." Eric closed the door to ensure the conversation stayed private. "I found a way to definitely replicate the results we discussed the other day. It involves using their own blood as a catalyst, and apparently injection doesn't work, it has to be absorbed through the skin." Dr. Tyler nodded in agreement. "Yes, that sounds excellent, good on you. You just keep working at replication and email the notes tonight. I want to be kept up to speed. I know someone in the government who may be able to speed this along to the next step. I have to tell you, Eric, this is the most advanced work that any of us students are creating." Eric basked in the glow of her praise, excited by the prospect of further research opportunity. He bid Dr. Tyler a good afternoon and skipped lunch himself, too excited to eat. Over the next few weeks Eric worked feverishly in his little lab. Dr. Tyler stopped by regularly for updates and he sent her emails of his notes. In late August he was required to have another medical workup for renewing his student visa. He hated having to take a day off, especially with Dr. Tyler dropping hints that the ministry was considering a human research trial. It was almost unbelievable to him. In the US, they would require years of work on animals before even thinking of using humans, but Eric wasn't very familiar with the New Zealand system and apparently it had fewer safeguards. Oh well, the better for his research. Of course, he had to break the barrier to creating selective brain degeneration. There was no way he could test the current serum, which could cause total regression, on an actual person. It was a week after he had his medical that Eric received an email from the New Zealand Immigration Service telling him he was now also required to have a dental checkup. Well, that was really too much. But he couldn't very well refuse. So Eric made a note in his schedule for the next day at 2 and returned to his work. He took a small white mouse, one he had named Neville, because it looked kind of British to him for some reason, and prepared to shave a small area on its belly. For most of his research, Eric had been careful not to name the mice because he couldn't name something he was planning to infect with a terrible fatal disease. They went by their numbers only. Now, though, he gave them all names because his current serum didn't really hurt them, it just gave them a fresh start, and it wasn't like a mouse would miss their memories, they were only mice after all. Eric shaved away a bit of Neville's hair and held him tight as the little mouse squirmed. Then Eric dipped the fingers of his double latex gloved hand into a small dish of white ointment and massaged it onto the bald spot. The mouse stayed still as he did so. Then Eric replaced the mouse in his cage and watched as the serum worked. It was hard to tell with a mouse how much had changed until he put it in the maze. It had run this maze dozens of times and currently it took it 55 seconds to reach the end. But 5 minutes after massaging the drug in, Eric put Neville in the maze and hit the start button on his watch. The mouse was totally lost. It took over 5 minutes to find the cheese and then only by accident. After several other tests, it was clear the mouse had regressed, but otherwise had no ill side effects, no twitching or agitation, nothing. Eric took down his notes and forwarded them to Dr. Tyler, then left for the night. Eric was surprised to find the dentist's office was empty when he arrived the next day. Usually this place would be filled with angry and anxious students, but now the waiting room was empty, the magazines lay neatly in a stack on the table and there was no receptionist. Eric was about to leave, figuring he got the time wrong or the office wrong, when an Asian woman popped her head out from behind the reception desk area. "Oh, hello, you here for checkup?" "Oh, yes I am." She nodded. "Yes, you can come right back, the doctor is out today, no patients, but the assistant will help you." Eric nodded and followed the woman back to a dentist chair. She got him seated and then assured him the assistant would be right in. Eric always felt uncomfortable at the dentist's. The room was so empty and uninviting and there were so many sharp tools, he could understand how a mouse in his lab must feel. A short blonde woman in pink scrubs walked in behind him carrying a clipboard. She wore a spit visor over her face. "Hello, Mr. Daniels, we just need to check your teeth and make sure everything is all normal, and we'll do a little cleaning first so we can see it well. Then we'll do some x-rays and you'll be all set." Eric nodded. "That's fine." She sat on a stool to his right and readied some tools. "I'm Christy, by the way. Sorry the doctor wasn't able to be here to do this, but no worries, I'll take good care of you. I promise to be gentle." Eric felt a bit at ease at her friendly demeanor. Christy took the electric brush and coated it in some white toothpaste. "Open wide." Eric opened his mouth and Christy began massaging his gums and his tongue with the paste. It tasted very sweet. She didn't press too hard, but it did make his gums tingle a lot. Actually, it was a pleasant kind of tingling. For 2 minutes he lay there while she brushed, and Eric noticed she never really got to his teeth. She just kept getting more white paste and massaging his gums and cheeks with it. And then he felt the odd tingling moving up to his temples and right at the center of his forehead. It was an odd sensation indeed. "I feel kind of funny." "Is that normal?" he asked. Christy smiled at him. "Don't worry about a thing, will be done very soon." "Okay," Eric agreed, but he did hope this was done soon. He was feeling kind of lightheaded on airy. "There we go, all done, now let's get you ready for x-rays. I have a gown for you to wear, so let's get your clothes off. Eric was confused as to why he needed his clothes off, but Christy was already pulling his sneakers off for him and his head felt so cloudy right now. Maybe she had used some kind of anesthetic he wasn't aware of. Yes, that had to be it. Feeling so muddled, Eric let Christy help undress him, feeling a bit embarrassed at both his inability to undress himself and at his agreement to get undressed in front of her. Finally, dressed in nothing but a gown, Eric lay back in the seat, tingling filling his cloudy head, while Christy went out to prepare the x-ray machine. Laying back, Eric noticed for the first time that there was a mobile hanging from the ceiling, slowly circling. Colorful plastic stars and animals hung from strings spiraling over his head. What on earth was that doing there in a dental office? Eric heard footsteps on the tiled floor as someone in women's shoes entered the room. But hadn't Christy had sneakers on? To his shock, it was not Christy, but Dr. Tyler standing over him in a short skirt and her white lab coat, her hair tied in a tight bun. She smiled down at him. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I have great news for you, Eric. We're starting the human research trial. Your research will move forward, isn't that great?" Eric was dumbfounded at first, but the shock seemed to suddenly clear his mind. "But I haven't worked out partial regression yet, when will we be starting?" "Right now, sweetie, we already have our first subject." "We do?" "Yes, dear, you." Eric was sure he had misheard her. "Me? What are you talking about?" "Calm down now. After all the work you put into this, I knew that it would all be a waste if we couldn't move to human trials and the government would take years to approve those, if ever. But you are in the perfect position to be the example. You have no close ties, no one will miss you, and you've already provided what would probably be your best contribution to the scientific world." Dr. Tyler spoke with real passion. It was as though Eric was not a person to her, but just another mouse awaiting her experimentation. Well, Eric was not going to let her do that. "No. I won't do it. Don't you understand that it would cause total, irreversible regression to infancy? I'd spend the next year laying in a pool of my own spittle and pee. I can't do that." Now, Eric, aren't you always talking about sacrifice, about greatness? You have the chance to give the medical world a huge break though, and all it requires is you sacrifice one thing, your mind. Eric fought back another spell of lightheadedness, fighting to remain focused even as his mind wanted to wander. "Look, this is unethical, we can't do it." "I'm sorry, but my answer is no." Dr. Tyler chuckled to herself. "Your answer? Honey, when did I ever ask you to volunteer? Tell me, how do you feel right now? This is very important," she said, taking out her notepad and pen, going into scientist mode, detached from the situation. Eric felt his pulse quicken, goosebumps raise on his arms. "Why, what do you mean?" Impatiently, Dr. Tyler asked, "How do you feel now? How is your head feeling?" Eric blinked, fogginess was returning, the alertness the shock of her appearance had brought was disappearing. "I feel very strange. My head tingles a lot and I'm, sort of. I don't remember, what did you ask?" Eric felt lost. He had been talking about something very important just a moment ago and now he had no idea what. "What's happening?" he pleaded, feeling increasing anxiety. "Don't worry about thing, Eric, you're going to get to do things all over again, dear. Soon you won't have a care in the world. After all the work you've put in, you certainly deserve a rest, a nice long holiday for your brain. It won't be so bad, I have a nice lady who just can't wait to be your mummy." Dr. Tyler gestured to the door and Christy walked back into Eric's field of vision. "Hi honey, guess what, you're gonna be mummy's precious little baby boy soon. I'm gonna take real good care of you sweetums, I promise. We'll go on the park and get you a little splash pool to play in, it will be nice. I've always wanted a little baby all my own." Christy gushed. Eric was feeling overwhelmed. He knew he had seen that woman before, but he couldn't quite place where. But as Christy and the woman in the white coat made silly faces at him, he felt his apprehension start to ebb. Slowly all the tension and anxiety left him and he began to feel quite nice. Eric wasn't sure why he was here and who the big people were, but they seemed very nice and he was the center of attention. There was a very pretty spinning thing on the ceiling and Eric watched it with awe. There were such bright, pretty colors. Eric thought he could almost reach out and touch them, but they always seemed just out of his reach. Then the big person with yellow hair leaned in close and covered her eyes. She was gone. Eric wondered how she did that, like magic. Then just like that there was again. "Peekaboo," she yelled. That was great, Eric giggled and clapped his hands, or at least he tried. He couldn't quite get them to coordinate now. That would have bothered him, but suddenly the big lady blew on his tummy and it tickled so much. The other lady had these bright jiggly things and she dangled them and shook them and Eric wondered what they were. He thought he should know. He wanted to touch them, surely then he'd know what they were. He wanted her to give them. "Bababagadu," he babbled at her. Had he said the right thing? He wasn't sure. What had he said? He couldn't think of any words. They were there, he was sure, but just out of reach, like the pretty spinny things above him. He reached out his hands and squealed more. It worked. She gave him the bright jingly things. Now what were they? Eric decided to put them in his mouth. They tasted funny, he chewed at them but got no further in figuring out what they were. But then he forgot about why he had wanted them. It felt nice to chew on them, so he focused on that. Dr. Mary Tyler finished making notes in her book and looked back down at Eric. The thin 24-year-old, the most brilliant student in the department, creator of advanced research, was sucking on a toy key set, saliva covering his chin and running in a rivulet down his cheek, his thin pale legs waving about aimlessly, his eyes vacant and crossed, focused on the toy he was chewing on. The drug had taken far too long to work in her opinion. It should be used in higher doses for effectiveness. At least Christy and Eric seemed happy. And now the research was all hers. As far as anyone would know, Eric had dropped out of school and left the country for points unknown. As an extra precaution, Christy decided to rename him Baby Mikey and tell her family he was her boyfriend who had been in a motorcycle accident. Eric certainly wouldn't mind the name change, he'd be far too busy putting all his new toys in his mouth. A month later, Mary headed out to Western Springs Park to meet Christy and Baby Mikey. It had been a very disappointing month for her. She had made no progress on the research even after performing countless tests on Mikey. She would lay differently shaped blocks in front of him and see if he could fit them into the right holes. He couldn't. Usually he would simply stick the colorful blocks in his mouth and gaze innocently up at her while drool dripped from his suckling mouth to the floor. She judged his mental capacity at 6 months. She thought he might progress faster than a real baby back to normal, or regain his mind suddenly. Neither happened. A month later she judged his mental age to be 7 months. It was a very warm day for September and lots of families were out playing in the park, kids feeding the swans and parents having picnics. It wasn't hard to spot Christy and Mikey. The 20-something was sitting in a big stroller adorned with Elmo decals, wearing a Big Bird t-shirt and a big nappy, sucking away at a dummy while he swung his long bare legs and feet out into the air and slapped them against the footrest. His eyes were gazing with excitement at all the people around the park. He felt no embarrassment, of course, he was just curious. "Hi, Mary," Christy exclaimed, then grabbing Mikey's hand said, "Can you say hi, baby? Say hi to Auntie Mary." She waved his limp hand for him, but Mikey was craning around the other direction to gawk at a swan, spitting out the dummy and babbling, "Ah ha 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 ba, mama," at the animals. "Hello dear, how is everything going?" "Oh, it's just wonderful, he really is just adorable, though it can be a handful. I just can't believe he was once a big university student, he's such a happy baby." "That's good to hear." Now here's the thing, I haven't had much luck making progress on the research, so what we need to do is get more subjects. So I need you to talk to all your friends from the fertility clinic and get the names of other women who have had trouble conceiving, especially single ones. Christy nodded. No worries, I'll get right to it. It would be wonderful to have a little playgroup. I think Mikey is quite lonely sometimes. Yes, exactly. I have very high hopes that with enough subject we can make progress. Back home again, Christy cut up and mashed the food that Mikey would have for dinner. It was hard work, but she enjoyed it thoroughly. It was very exciting to think that soon there would be other oversized babies like her little one. Every day was an adventure for Mikey. She really envied him. He was perfectly happy and didn't understand or care that he had lost something. Right now he was sitting in a baby bouncer, his toes just brushing the floor, bouncing up and down with glee, screeching his success, a smile that could light a city on his face. Mikey loved his bouncy seat. It was so fun to go up and down over and over. How could this ever get old? He was glad Mummy took his shirt off. It was scratchy and he liked feeling the air on his tummy. The carpet was nice and soft on his toes too. Then Mummy came and took him out of the bouncy seat and he sat on his bum on the carpet. He sat up all by himself. He was very proud of that. Mummy sat down with him and sung a silly song. He didn't know what she said, but he liked her voice. He smiled. She wiggled his toes as she sang. He liked that even more. Mikey stuck his fingers in his mouth and sucked. That felt really nice. He couldn't imagine being happier. Mary sat at home in front of her computer sipping tea. The work with Christy had gone well and several women were interested, including one of her other students, Melanie. Since most of the women were single, of course, that just left the problem of where to find suitable candidates. But always a resourceful woman, she soon had a solution. Mary logged on to another ABDL site and typed in the personal section, looking for a break from the real world, want to enjoy the tender care of a mummy again. Come spend the week at Nanny Mary's nursery in Mount Eden. It's an experience that can't be missed. Mary had several responses by that evening. She smiled with success as she deleted their names and numbered the emails instead. The names were irrelevant, they wouldn't be needing them anymore. She would have all the test subjects she needed. It was a small price to pay, after all. For corners. It wasn't nostalgia that brought Maynard back home. His mother said she'd found some of things of his and she wanted to give him a chance to go through them before they got tossed out. Maynard could have sworn he took everything of value when he moved out, but what the hell, he came anyway. His parents were selling the house and it couldn't hurt to take one last look. He parked his Grandam on the street and walked across the ill-kept lawn to the front door. Dad must be slipping, he thought. When he was a boy, the lawn, along with the little garden out back, was a point of pride. One time he was playing football with his brother in the backyard and an overthrown pass sent Augie reeling ass backwards into some tomato plants. What followed didn't hurt Augie so much because his backside was already numb from the fall, but Maynard wasn't quite as fortunate. The door opened before he had a chance to open it and he nearly ran smack into his mother. Mom had let her hair go all the way grey and wore it short. That and the glasses and the double chin made her a stranger to him. She looked more like an aunt he saw once in a blue moon than the woman who raised him. Maynard, she said, giving him a perfunctory peck on the cheek. Your things are in your room. I was just going to get the mail. He reached behind him and snagged a handful of magazines and envelopes from the mailbox. Here, he said, passing them along. The inside of the house had a ghostly feel to it. So much had been moved around, replaced or otherwise altered. Yet Maynard could look at any given spot and remember exactly what it used to look like. The blue recliner in the family room, for instance, had supplanted an older beige model that Maynard nearly broke when he tried to find out how far back it would go. Likewise, the bookcase in the dining room that now lay almost bare had once held volumes of baseball almanacs that Dad purchased and the males of the house read to tatters. But with 2 of the 3 males gone and so much information available online, the case had outlived its usefulness. Remembrance was hard work and Maynard ducked into the kitchen to find a snack. He'd made it all the way into the fridge before he realized the old man was standing behind him, staring. "Grab me a Coke while you're in there," he said. A spiteful flare compelled him to tell Dad to get his own fucking Coke, but Maynard controlled himself and silently passed a can into the old man's hand. He grabbed another for himself and shut the door. Dad was shorter than him, practically blind and cursed with a bad back and stubby fingers. Still, Maynard couldn't shake the sense that he was sizing him up. "Everything going okay?" he asked. Maynard shrugged and reached for the cookie jar. "Can't complain. You seen your mother yet?" Maynard nodded. His mouth was full of chocolate chip. "She looks tired," he said after he'd swallowed. "We both are," Dad said. "The move, well, I don't think she expected it. I think she figured we'd be here long enough to see grandchildren running around this house. I figured the same thing too, for a time. Course now I know better." The last sentence was delivered with a snicker that made Maynard ball his hands into fists and grunt. He looked again at his father, searching for some sign of provocation in those cool blue eyes. But the hate wasn't there anymore. The old man was just going through the old motions. "I'll be in my room," Maynard grumbled. He was glad their new place was even further away. It gave him an excuse not to visit. Maynard's room was much as it had been the last time he came back. The bed was neatly made, the walls were bare and the floor was free of clutter. It was a far cry from his teenage years, when vulgar posters and dirty dishes and wayward clumps of clothes made his parents afraid to venture inside. If he wanted to, he could pick a spot and a memory would come, just like it did downstairs. But that wasn't a game that Maynard wanted to play, not with these 4 corners. Unfortunately, he might not have a choice. A stack of erstwhile belongings sat on his bed, beckoning him like a misshapen siren. Maynard approached with caution. He felt the bed springs groan as he parked himself, another reminder of all that had changed since he lived there. With a curious eye, he went about rediscovering what his mother had saved from permanent destruction. At the top of the pile was an issue of Playboy. It surprised Maynard for 2 reasons, the first being that he did a pretty good job to get rid of all his porn when he cleared out, and the second being that it seemed like exactly the kind of thing Mom would throw away. It didn't make any sense, unless... Maynard checked the date and scoped out the old-school hairstyles. Yep, he thought, this was the one. This was the very first adult magazine he could lay claim to, given to him by his very own father when he was 13. The old man laid it on him like it was a rite of passage, which Maynard supposed it was. He was going through puberty at the time and skin mags were valuable guides to the carnal world that awaited his future self. Dated or not, Maynard was glad to have it. Use it in good health, Dad had told him. And don't tell your mother I gave you that. Maynard heeded the warning at first, but foolishly ended up showing it to his prepubescent brother. Actually, he didn't show it to Orgy as much as Orgy caught him looking at it and wanted to know what it was. Maynard, feeling like a big shot, told him what it was and that Dad had given it to him because he was practically a man now anyway. Envious, Orgy wanted to look too. Fat chance, Maynard told him. Look at you. You're still a little kid. Come on, Orgy insisted. Maynard decided to be magnanimous and relented. Unfortunately, Orgy's exclamation of "wow, neat," drew the attention of their mother. Mom snatched the magazine and tore into Maynard without mercy. After laying into Maynard for exposing his brother to such filth, she demanded to know where he got it from. He waffled and dodged and equivocated, but in the end, she broke him. What followed nearly touched off World War III. How could you? Mom shrieked. What was going through your mind, giving him that? He's a growing boy. Dad snapped. He needs to learn. And so it went for more days that Maynard cared to remember until one day Dad spontaneously took them all out for a steak dinner. It wasn't quite the Peace of Westphalia, but hostility ceased. It was stupid, he knew, but Maynard couldn't help but wonder if Orgy would have turned out differently if he'd been allowed to see more of the magazine. The pile on Maynard's bed contained a few more firsts. There was his first concert ticket, which was for some god-awful band he regretted he ever listened to. There was his first leather jacket, which was tattered and far too short. There was even a letter from the middle school vice principal commending Maynard for his quick reaction when Joey Belanoza got hit in the head by a fly ball during gym class and passed out. Looking at everything made the four corners of his room feel alive again. It brought Maynard precisely the nostalgia he'd hoped to avoid. This was supposed to be in and out, nice and easy. Instead, he found himself thinking. Maynard hated that. He'd done enough thinking in that room for one lifetime. Then, at the bottom of the pile, Maynard found something that nearly made his heart stop, his diaper. She'd saved his diaper. For heaven's sake, he whispered. When he was 8 years old, Maynard was a helplessly prolific bedwetter. Like other mothers who tired of wet sheets, his resorted to diapering her son at night. To his adult self, it made logical sense. To an 8-year-old, it was catastrophic. Maynard rubbed the old cloth between his fingers and the memories came. He found himself on his back on that bed more than 15 years ago, watching as Mom removed the diapers, pins, waterproof pants and powder from the plastic Food Lion bags. He had already been disrobed and positioned, but that part of him that swore she wouldn't really go through with it was getting a second wind. Now that part compelled him to try to get back up. Maynard, Mom cautioned. No, Mom, he said. I'm not gonna do it. I won't drink anything before bed, okay? We tried that, she said. Remember? Well, try it again, he said with his arms crossed. Because I'm not gonna wear a diaper. She sighed. Do I have to get your father? She asked. That sat him back down in a hurry and brought his dreams of escape to a crashing end. He was moist-eyed and red-cheeked as Mom slid the thick cloth folds under him, but the worst parts were yet to come. He would go on to experience being stuck with the pins courtesy of Mom's slipping hand and suffering the indignation of her sliding the waterproof pants up and tucking every inch of extra fabric in. But the worst part was Orgy, watching from his doorway and giggling. He shot his brother a look that could kill, but it took Mom's admonishment to ultimately make him leave. He wore those diapers to bed every night for about a month. Every evening, Mom would come and put them on him and they would remain on the following morning when he joined the family for breakfast. Every threatening gesture he made against Orgy was negated by the words, or I'll tell about your diapers. In short, life sucked. The bedwetting passed, but the memories of the diapers did not. Maynard made a point of finding them and throwing them away before he cleared out. Apparently, there was one that had gotten away from him. Not this time, he said. He prepared to fling it into the trash, but held it a while longer. It was funny how something so innocuous could screw up his life so much. After all, if it hadn't been for the diapers, things probably wouldn't have gone the way they did with Krista. He was 16 and he'd been on dates before, but she was the first one he'd felt he had a future with. It wasn't that Krista was smoking hot, she was a little on the short side, or especially eager. If anything, she was guarded, it was that she seemed more real than the other girls. She was a stream, uncontaminated by the sewage pipe of adolescent bullshit. It was that realness that led him to confess, within these same four corners, that he had once been a bedwetter. And though he felt emboldened enough to trust her with that, he still expected some degree of fallout. Taunting wasn't likely, but a look of disgust or an abrupt exit seemed within reason. Instead, Krista merely shrugged. "That's it?" Maynard asked. "Maynard," she said. "You were 8. 8-year-old boys do gross things." He laughed in spite of himself. All that time he'd been flogging himself over it, and for what? The success of his confession led Maynard to reason, perhaps naively, that Krista was the only one who would ever understand him. And that reasoning, in turn, allowed him to drop the inhibitions he may have had with other girls. It was again within the same 4 corners that Maynard made a play to lose his virginity. He and Krista had been together for a good while now, and something in his teenage reasoning said the time was right. They were making out like they always did when he tried to slip a hand under her jeans. Krista sat bolt upright. "Maynard," she said. "Don't." "Why not?" he asked. "Just don't. I thought you liked me." "I do like you." "Then why?" "There are some things I just can't tell you about," she said. He felt like he was being treated like a child, and he didn't like it. He couldn't picture some of the other guys his age being talked to like this. "That's great, Krista," he said in a patronizing tone. "But I don't see what that has to do with us doing the deed." Krista's eyes welled up and she abruptly tore away from him, mumbling as she bounded out of the room. She was in such a hurry to get away from him and those 4 corners and that house that she took no notice of oncoming traffic and promptly got herself hit by a car. Maynard's curiosity is all that staved of suicide. Lord knows his guilt demanded it. It wasn't until 2 weeks after the funeral that he got his answers. Krista's sister took him aside and questioned him thoroughly about her relationship. It was an uncomfortable topic, but he felt he owed her some truth. He held nothing back. "So you never actually?" "No," he said. "I didn't. I wanted to, but she freaked. Then I wanted to ask her what I did and say I'm sorry, but she was gone." "Marcy, what did I do?" The sister sniffled and gave him a pitying look. "You reminded her of our uncle," she said. "Your uncle?" Maynard asked. "What does your uncle?" "Oh, shit. I'm sorry." "She was 10, Marcy said, solemnly." Maynard nodded. He buried his suicidal notions, but he found he couldn't really get close to anyone after that. His father later tried to set him up with the daughter of a co-worker, but things never panned out. The girl's brother confronted him one day and asked him if he was a queer, like Orgy had recently revealed himself to be. Maynard broke his nose. Things went south with the old man and never really recovered. Not long after that, he was gone. "Fuck this place," Maynard snarled, scattering the pile back across the bed with a swipe of his hand. He began to wonder if the whole thing wasn't some kind of setup, a ploy by Mom so he'd get all misty-eyed and come visit them at their new house. If that was her intention, it had backfired in spades. Then again, he couldn't say he was surprised. When it came to his childhood, he and his parents were acting out Rashomon. Exasperated, Maynard began to gather everything on the bed back into another pile. He decided he would take everything with him, even the diaper. Removed from the 4 corners, he doubted they would have much power over him. Mom spotted him on his way out, the belongings tucked in a loose ball under one arm. "Is that everything?" she asked. "Yep," he said. "Can you stay for dinner?" "Probably not." She frowned. "I hope you'll make more of an effort to see us at the new house," she said. "You and your brother both." "See ya, Mom," Maynard said. He blew her an air kiss with his free hand and stepped out without saying goodbye to his father. There was more than enough room for the pile in the back of his Grandam. As he slid behind the driver's seat, he felt the familiar urge to speed away and leave the house behind him post-haste. He took caution, however, to watch the road for signs of upset girls. Big changes. Miss Frances banged her ruler on her desk. Class, your attention please. We have a guest speaker today. She banged her ruler a few more times until the majority of students were looking at her. Olivia Cameron awoke on the second bang, and didn't look up until the fourth. She found Miss Frances' lectures to be an excellent cure for insomnia, but a guest speaker might actually be interesting. The village was small enough to only need a school with 4 classrooms, and this one contained the oldest group of students, ranging from 15 to 18. Guest speakers were generally employers looking for potential employees, and with Mrs. Cameron nagging her 17-year-old daughter to find a job, it couldn't hurt to listen. The classroom door opened and a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard and receding hairline stepped in. He nodded to the teacher. Miss Frances. He cleared his throat. Good afternoon, students. I'm Professor Cornelius Underwood, Chief Agrologist of. A student cut him off. Ogres? Come on. Other students giggled. Miss Frances pointed her ruler at the offending student. Mr. Thomas. I'll see you after class. This elicited more giggles. Thank you. Professor Underwood continued, don't think I haven't heard all this before. Ogres stay on their side of the forbidden woods. There hasn't been an ogre sighting in over 100 years. They don't affect us, why should we care, right? He nodded to himself. I'll tell you why. To make sure they stay on their side of the woods, and we don't see them in our territory. Rolling her eyes, Olivia turned her attention back to the paper on her desk, which she had been using to draw unflattering pictures of her teacher. Vigilance is required, but I'm only one man. I need an apprentice to carry on my work. I have special permission to go into the forbidden woods to make contact with the ogres and make sure there are no problems. This forms the basis of my research, and my apprentice would join me on these expeditions. He glanced around the room to see if any students showed an interest. The boy in front of Olivia raised his hand. Wait. You want someone to go with you to meet the ogres? Isn't that really dangerous? Underwood let out a little chuckle and shook his head. Ogres are quite a bit bigger than humans, so they don't view an individual as any threat. Larger numbers might set them off, which is why I go alone. I've picked up some ogreish over the years, so I know they trust me enough to start bringing an assistant, which is why I'm here. Olivia yawned. Learning ogreish didn't sound like her idea of an exciting job. The professor continued. Applicants need to submit a writing sample. A 5-page report on the trees found in the Western Forest should give me an idea of your observational skills. Miss Frances has agreed to look at your submissions, so you'll receive writing credit for them. Indeed. Miss Frances looked around the room, finally settling on Olivia. There are many students who could benefit greatly from this opportunity, if only to improve a sagging grade. Wouldn't you agree, Miss Cameron? Olivia fought the urge to comment on what else was sagging, but admitted that her grades needed the help. At the very least, a hike in the forest would get her away from her mother's badgering for a while. Underwood gave a brief bow. My residence is on the outskirts of the Forbidden Woods on the south side of town. Reports can be submitted there or with your teacher. Thank you for your time. He shook hands with Miss Frances and made his exit. Well, I hope to see reports from all of you. Once more Miss Frances locked eyes with Olivia. That brings us to the end of the day. Class dismissed, except you, Mr. Thomas. With one groaning exception, the class gathered their supplies and filed out of the school. Blinking in the sunlight and still somewhat tired from her impromptu nap, Olivia took a meandering path home hoping to be fully awake by the time she arrived. She first made her way past the south gate to catch a glimpse of Underwood's house. Sure enough, a small residence that was little more than a shack was barely visible in the distance, right near the edge of the Forbidden Woods. He must be crazy to live there. Oh, I believe it helps, but it's hardly a necessity. Olivia tried not to gasp as she turned and saw Professor Underwood towering before her. Suddenly she was quite interested in her shoes. "Ah, good afternoon. Sir. No need to be embarrassed, you're hardly the first to make that observation, miss." Cameron, was it? Waiting until after she nodded, Underwood continued. "It's because of the wolves that inhabit those woods, correct?" Olivia had managed to get her blushing under control by this point and met his gaze, which was no easy feat, and 6'8", he was nearly a foot and a half taller than her. "Well, the wolves and the ogres, but I guess you have an understanding with them." "So mainly the wolves." She nodded to herself after working out the logic. Underwood chuckled. "It's partly because of the ogres that I have nothing to fear from the wolves. You see, the wolves will instinctively run from the scent of an ogre, and after years of interacting with them," he trailed off. Olivia stared blankly for a moment until a look of disgust crossed her face. "Oh. I guess that'd do it." She leaned forward a little and sniffed. "You don't smell that bad, no offense." "None taken, the scent's hardly noticeable unless you have a keen sense of smell." Underwood stroked his beard. "I've taken up enough of your time, I'm sure you have a report to start." "Good day, miss." He winked and passed through the gate. Olivia rolled her eyes once his back was turned. "Good day, Professor." She continued on her way, noting that the wooden brick houses she passed must be more sophisticated than whatever caves the ogres were using. Even at the edge of the kingdom, they could do better than that. After taking a few more detours, Olivia arrived at the small house she currently shared with only her mother, as her father was currently with a logging crew far to the west and wouldn't return for nearly a month. After closing the door and setting down her school supplies, she shouted a greeting, "Mom, I'm home." "Olivia? You're a little late, aren't you?" "Mrs." Cameron emerged from the kitchen, undoing the apron she had been wearing. She looked like an older version of her daughter, with her auburn hair starting to show streaks of grey. "Come on now, dinner's ready." They both sat down at the table, and the elder Cameron immediately set to work. "Wasting time after school again?" Olivia shook her head as she shoveled a forkful of corn into her mouth. "We had a guest speaker today, and I stayed late to talk to him." While not the whole truth, it was close enough. She did speak to him after class ended. Her mother raised an eyebrow. "Guest speaker? With a job offer, perhaps?" Her eyes seemed to light up as she spoke. "Aha." Olivia quickly nodded. It was Professor Underwood, that ogre expert. "We're supposed to write a report on the Western Forest so he can see how well we write, and then he'll pick someone to be his assistant." "Mrs." Cameron paused a moment before leaning in close and saying, "Ogres, you say? Sounds dangerous." "I heard a girl around your age from 2 towns over vanished in those woods to the south. They say the ogres got her." "Oh, people exaggerate," Olivia said. "I heard she was running from the law. She's probably in a new town with a new name by now." They made small talk for the rest of the meal, but Mrs. Cameron brought the subject up again as they cleared the table. "Well, you better get a move on, you've still got a few hours of daylight to go into the forest to start your research." Olivia whined, but Matilda no buts, young lady. "Mrs. Cameron sternly waved her finger. "I've heard from Miss Francis enough times already this year." Olivia sighed. "Fine, just let me go change." "Mrs. Cameron shook her head. "And make more laundry?" "I think not." Olivia glanced down at herself. She was wearing a long green dress with short sleeves. "You expect me to go hiking in a dress?" "You're not climbing a mountain, you'll be fine." "Fine." Olivia sighed. She grabbed a green ribbon that matched her dress and used it to tie her hair back so it would stay out of her eyes. After collecting a pen and paper, she said goodbye to her mother and set out for the West Gate. After about 90 minutes of walking, Olivia had to admit she was impressed with herself. She had covered quite a long distance. At the time, taking notes while walking seemed like a good use of time, but spending a little too much time paying attention to her paper and not where she was going had left her somewhat confused. As she passed another group of unfamiliar trees, she was worried about not getting home by nightfall. "Hello? Anyone out there?" Olivia asked again. She had hoped to find a fellow student also wandering the woods, but so far she seemed to be alone. After a few more minutes of wandering, she came upon a river. Aha! This river leads back into town. She smiled to herself, until she realized she had no idea if the town was upriver or downriver. It was an important point, as the river not only passed through the town and the western woods, into continued south into ogre territory. Follow the river flow, and into town you go. That doesn't sound right. She ceased her efforts to remember the old rhyme when she heard a rustling in the nearby bushes. Hello. Taking a deep breath, Olivia took a tentative step forward. Hey, are you out here for that report too? She asked rather hopefully just as the wolf emerged from the bushes. Olivia might have been thinking that she must have wandered into ogre territory, since hunters keep the wolves in check near her town, but she wasn't thinking about much as she ran in a blind panic. Not even aware of what direction she was going, Olivia pumped her legs harder than she ever had in her life. While not fat by any means, she carried a few extra pounds and running wasn't one of her standard activities. Help! Wolf! After what seemed like hours but was more like minutes, she had the misfortune of getting the hem of her dress snagged on a stray tree branch. Her momentum jerked her around and sent her tumbling down a nearby hill, where she landed in a heap. Blacking out for a few seconds, the first thing Olivia noticed was a sharp pain in both of her legs. Already pushed to the limit, the fall had done them no favors. While they didn't feel broken, it would likely be some time before she could walk easily. The second thing she noticed was that she had apparently landed in a puddle. A warm puddle, which she soon realized had recently been the contents of her bladder. A sudden lapse of bladder control was the least of her problems, as she heard a growling at the top of the hill and getting closer. Nice wolfie. The wolf approached, and Olivia looked around to see if there was a rock or a stick she could use as a weapon, but found nothing. Preparing for the worst, Olivia was surprised when the wolf whimpered and turned around, ruining back the way it came. Ha! That's right, I showed you. She glanced down at herself and sighed. There was a nasty gash up the side of her skirt where it snagged the tree, and now it clung to her legs because she wet herself. Olivia tried to stand, but fell right on her posterior. As she did so, she heard what sounded like a chuckle behind her. That's not a wolf. Slowly turning her head, her jaw dropped at what she saw. She could almost be mistaken for a well-built human, if not for the greenish-grey skin. Olivia had never seen an ogre before, and she took a moment just to look her over. She wore a simple black knee-length dress and a pair of leather shoes. Her hair was a very light red, almost pink, and was tied back using what looked like a bone. She was smiling as she leaned over towards Olivia and said something she didn't understand. Unsure of what to do, Olivia gave a quick wave. She guessed the ogre's height at around 15 feet, so she felt it was a good idea to stay on her good side. Thanks for scaring the wolf. You wouldn't happen to know which way leads out of ogre territory, would you? She didn't know how the ogre would respond, but she didn't expect to be scooped up. Hey! The ogre gave her bottom a pat and said something else. Oh, I don't usually do that, are you giving me a lift? Ruffling her hair, the ogre set off, although Olivia wasn't sure where. They soon entered a clearing, and Olivia got her first look at the ogre village. Expecting caves, she was surprised to see row after row of stone huts, that while simple by human standards, were considerably more advanced than what she assumed they were capable of. Hey, nice place you've got here. Now, if you turn around, I can show you mine, sound good? Olivia sighed, she almost hoped that would work. It was starting to get colder out, and her torn, wet dress was beginning to feel quite uncomfortable. She gasped as they stopped in front of two axe-wielding ogres, thinking they were about to finish her off, until she realized they were chopping wood. The younger ogre stared at Olivia, while the other had a conversation with her rescuer. They both nodded and made motions with their arms as they spoke, but Olivia had no idea what was going on. After finishing with the woodsman, they continued into the village and stopped in front of a house, where the ogre knocked on the door. It was answered by another female ogre, this one a bit shorter and a bit heavier. Her brown hair was too short for a bone decoration, but Olivia was slightly amused by her earrings, which appeared to be made of turtle shells. They had a conversation just as unintelligible as the last, and Olivia squirmed a little, trying to get her damp skirt to stop clinging to her. The two ogres laughed, and Shelley, which was how Olivia had decided to identify her, waved and closed her door. Finally, after walking 2 more houses down the line, they stopped. Olivia asked, "Is this your house?" The ogre carried her around to the side of the house and set her down next to a wooden washtub, which looked like it might be used for laundry. She could hear the river nearby, which must be where it was filled. "Are you going to wash my dress?" "That's okay, I can do it at home." Olivia thought she was right, as the ogre easily pulled her dress off. "Hey! That's not necessary." She tried to cover herself, but the ogre quickly stripped her of her shoes, undergarments, and hair ribbon. Before Olivia could object, she found herself dunked in the washtub, sputtering and splashing. Whistling a happy tune to herself, the ogre went about cleaning her with a washcloth, doing a thorough job, much to Olivia's chagrin. After what seemed like entirely too long, Olivia was pulled out of the tub and wrapped in a towel, cradled in the ogre's arms. She was carried to the front door, where the woodsman had arrived carrying some sort of table. They were allowed in, and they set it down in an empty corner. The hut itself was sparsely decorated. Olivia could only make out a bed, a table and chairs, and what appeared to be a fireplace. The windows lacked glass, and instead relied on wooden shutters to keep the elements out. While Olivia observed all this, Shelley arrived with an armful of cloth. She placed the largest piece, which looked like a mattress, on top of the table. She then stocked the table's lower shelf with the other pieces, most of which looked like white towels. Olivia was freed from her towel, having since been dried off, and placed naked on the table. She attempted to cover herself while her rescuer took one of the smaller white towels Shelley had brought and wrapped it around her waist and hips. Shelley handed her a metal object, and it was used to secure the towel in place. Olivia stopped resisting at this point, as she was busy trying to figure out what was going on. It all seemed strangely familiar. "That looks kind of like a safety pin. This is a diaper." "Hey! I don't usually wet myself, it just happened that one time." She tried to tug down on the diaper, but the ogre grunted something and gave her a swat on the bottom before sternly waving her finger. Okay, I'll leave it on." She was finally dressed in a loose-fitting grey dress, which she guessed might have been intended as a shirt. Olivia was pretty distracted while getting dressed, as she now noticed a second piece of furniture had been brought into the hut, and a mattress and sheets had been placed within it. She stared blankly as she figured it out. She wasn't put in diapers because they thought she was incontinent, they thought she was a baby. She was scooped up again and started to protest, but Shelley handed Mama a bottle, which was promptly placed in Olivia's mouth. She wanted to complain, but she really was thirsty. And the way Mama rocked her was pretty soothing, especially after such a rough day. She was being carried to the crib as she drifted off. Birds were chirping, a pleasant breeze was blowing, and Olivia groggily awoke as the first rays of the sun shone through the open window. What a crazy dream she had that night. Instead of safely returning from her trip through the woods, she was attacked by a wolf and rescued by an ogre, who mistook her for a baby and took home. She shook her head at the silly notion as she stretched, but encountered an obstacle in rolling out of bed. Suddenly wide awake, she realized she was in a crib, and was indeed still in the home of the ogre. She looked around, and found the ogre she had dubbed Mama in her bed, snoring lightly. Hello. Good morning. Can I get out now? Mama continued to snore. Olivia suspected some maintained crying might get her attention, but really didn't want to risk angering her. It's okay, I'll just sit here for a while. She sighed and attempted to stand, using the crib bars for support. Her legs still felt quite sore, and she was barely upright for a few seconds before falling back down on her diapered rear. She lifted up her dress to examine the garment and sighed as she noticed the feeling in her bladder. No chance for a bathroom break, huh? Getting no response, Olivia pondered removing the diaper. The light swat on the bottom she received following her attempt last night had been just a warning. Should she tempt fate? Looking around, it was clear that even if she got the diaper off, she didn't have anywhere to go but the mattress she was sitting on. Olivia sat fidgeting for several more minutes, until the pain grew too great and she decided to just do it. It took a moment of straining to get started, but once she did, she was unable to stop until her bladder was nearly empty. Blushing furiously, she shifted about and found the diaper barely felt wet, and certainly better than her damp dress had the night before. Noting that Mama was still snoring, she laid back in the crib once more to wait. The next thing Olivia knew, Mama was leaning over the side of the crib and smiling at her, so she suspected she had drifted off again. "Ah, hey there." She waved meekly. Mama smiled wider and waved back, then gave her bottom a pat and said something. Olivia squeaked and tried to scoot away from the pat, but Mama scooped her up into a hug before laying her down on the changing table. She was quickly stripped of her dress and left wearing just her wet diaper, crossing her arms in an attempt to cover herself. "Hey now, I keep telling," she trailed off as Mama unpinned her diaper and placed it in a bucket by the table. Now attempting to cover up on top and down below, she glared at Mama, then giggled uncontrollably as her bottom was cleaned with a damp washcloth. After applying some sort of powder, Olivia found herself pinned into another diaper. Mama gave Olivia a poke in the stomach, eliciting another giggle, and pulled a shirt over her head. Olivia stared at it and realized it was in fact the top of her green dress, the torn skirt having been removed. Mama then put her in some simple booties and used the hair ribbon she had been using the night before to secure some sort of stick in her hair. Olivia reached back and realized it was a bone, much like the larger one in Mama's hair. Thanks." After looking her outfit over and nodding to herself, Mama carried Olivia to the table and sat down with the girl sitting on her lap. "Couldn't find a high chair yet, huh?" Mama shifted Olivia so she was sitting facing the side, then took a spoon that was sitting in a bowl and held it in front of Olivia's mouth. She eyed it suspiciously. "What's that?" Opening her mouth was all the opportunity Mama needed, and she forced the spoon into her mouth. She tried to resist, but it actually tasted quite good. Olivia guessed it was some sort of fruit. "Ooh, more please." She smiled, being pleasantly surprised by the taste, and having not eaten since dinner. After finishing the bowl of mashed fruit, Mama set Olivia down on the floor with a bottle and went about eating her own breakfast. Olivia drank the milk, which tasted slightly different from the cow's milk she was familiar with, and made a note to try to see what kind of animals the ogres kept around. She couldn't see everything Mama had to eat, but did notice a rather large citrus fruit. Once Mama had finished and cleared the table, she scooped up Olivia and took her empty bottle, then held her so she was facing over the ogre's shoulder. "What are you doing?" Her question was answered as Mama gave her several pats on the back until she burped. "Oh." Professor Underwood answered the furious knocking on his door, expecting an overly eager student ready to hand in their report. What he saw was a distraught-looking middle-aged woman he didn't recognize, although she seemed vaguely familiar. "You're Underwood, the ogre expert, right?" the woman asked. Underwood nodded. "Indeed I am. How may I help you, miss?" She answered, "Mrs. Cameron, Loretta Cameron. My daughter Olivia said she talked to you about a report yesterday." "Ah, yes." Underwood motioned for her to come inside. "Does she need help?" Oh, I was just making tea, would you like a cup? Mrs. Cameron declined the offer. She never came back. Raising an eyebrow, the professor asked, never came back from where? The woods. Mrs. Cameron said, flustered. She went in to research that report last night and never came back. Patting the back of Mrs. Cameron's hand, Underwood tried to sound reassuring. I'll set off immediately. If the ogres know anything about what happened, I'll find out. The color drained from Mrs. Cameron's face. You think the ogres did something to her? Realizing his mistake, he quickly shook his head. Of course not, they never attack humans at random. It's just possible that if your daughter is lost, they might have seen something. This calmed down Mrs. Cameron somewhat. Thank you, Professor. Underwood escorted her to the door and retrieved his walking stick. I'm going to the ogre village with all haste. I'd advise you to wait at your home. Center, is center. About an hour after breakfast, there was a knock at Mama's door. Olivia was sitting on the floor leaning against a leg of the crib, craning her neck. She recognized the caller as Shelley, one of the ogres she encountered the night before. Mama and Shelley had a discussion, and Olivia noticed a second, younger ogre hiding behind Shelley's leg.